The first letter came taped to my mailbox the morning after I moved in, printed on stiff ivory paper with the Lakeside Estates HOA logo stamped in gold foil. The words were polite on the surface, but underneath was a tone of absolute authority. All structures on your property are subject to architectural review, including but not limited to any non-permanent structures, sheds, or storage units. Late that night, I pulled up county property records, curious about where Alan lived. For the first time since moving in, I could drink my morning coffee without flinching at the sound of a knock on the door, or the sight of a certified letter in my mailbox. Her name was Marie Jenkins, a retired school teacher with a kindly face, but she'd always been Alan's right hand on the board. I knew she might try to settle the old score. The shed still stood, red and battered, but defiant, almost as if it shared my stubborn streak. Neighbors kept their distance at first, whispering behind my back about how I'd pulled off such a ruthless move. Some seemed scared of me like I was some corporate shark, but a few others nodded politely when they saw me in the yard, as if to say they admired what I'd done, even if they couldn't admit it out loud. Turned out he had a huge corner lot house, 4 bedrooms, pool, all the trimmings. But something caught my eye. His mortgage lien was public record. The numbers didn't look good. Alan was underwater, owing more than the house was worth. If he missed a couple of payments, he was finished. And that gave me an idea so bold it made me grin for the first time in weeks. If Alan could use financial leverage against me, why couldn't I do the same to him? I called a friend of mine, a small-time investor who dabbled in distressed mortgages. I explained the situation, and he laughed, but agreed to help. Within 2 weeks, my friend negotiated to buy Alan's mortgage from the bank at a steep discount. Legally, it was airtight. I became Alan Forbes' new lender of record. I controlled the note on his house. Suddenly, the power dynamic flipped overnight. The next time I showed up to the whole office, Alan barely glanced at me until I calmly placed a letter on his desk informing him of the new ownership of his loan. His eyes went wide, the color drained from his face. I told him, point blank, that any further action against my shed would constitute harassment, and that, as his lender, I'd be watching. He tried to stammer something about conflict of interest, but he had no legal ground to stand on. The board was silent. Nobody wanted to cross me now that I literally held their president's financial leash. A week later, I posted a formal appeal with the HOA. Nobody objected. Nobody even looked me in the eye. The fines were dismissed and the record of violation wiped clean. I kept the shed standing, exactly where it had been for nearly 50 years. But I didn't stop there. Alan still owed a balloon payment, and I made sure to call it in. When he couldn't pay, I foreclosed on the mortgage, just like any bank would. I bought his house at auction for pennies on the dollar and served him with an eviction notice the very next day. The man who had tried to bulldoze my grandfather, as shed was now packing boxes and leaving the neighborhood, forced out by the same system he once used to bully me. I stood in my backyard that night, breathing in the familiar smell of old wood and oil and hay. The shed was safe, and so was the memory of the man who built it. Sometimes you have to fight fire with fire. Sometimes you have to beat tyrants at their own game. And if you're lucky, you get to watch them drive away while your shed still stands. Proud and weathered, a monument to a family that refused to be erased. Please contact the Architectural Review Committee within 10 days. I had barely unpacked the kitchen boxes. The shed they referred to was a small, weather-beaten thing, built by my grandfather back in the 70s. It stood behind the house, hidden from the road by a stand of old oaks, with its faded red paint and a sagging roof that leaked every time it rained. But to me, it wasn't just a shed. It was where my grandfather taught me to sharpen a mower blade, where he stored his welding tools, where he kept a small framed photograph of him and my grandmother on their wedding day. Tearing it down felt like tearing out a piece of family history, and I had no intention of letting that happen, HOA or not. I tossed the letter onto the dining table and went back to stacking plates. 10 days later, a second letter arrived, this time certified mail. They meant business. It listed 3 code violations, unapproved. Structure, deteriorating roof, and improper setbacks. Their solution was simple: demolish it within 30 days, or they'd fine me $500 per day until I complied. I felt my hands shaking while I read it. There was no way I could just bulldoze it. That shed had more soul than any of these cookie-cutter McMansions stacked up around me, with their perfect vinyl siding and trimmed hedges. The next morning, I tried to talk to them reasonably. I showed up at the HOA office with a binder full of photographs of the shed, old building permits, even a letter from the county saying the structure predated modern zoning. The HOA president, whose name was Alan Forbes, didn't even bother looking up from his laptop. He had slick back hair, a too white smile, and wore a golf shirt with a logo for a country club I couldn't afford. He was the sort of man who thought a spreadsheet could settle any argument. When I tried to explain my grandfather had built it, Alan just raised one eyebrow. Sentimental value, he said, doesn't override deed restrictions. He closed the folder and handed it back to me. I felt like an insect under a magnifying glass. That night, I couldn't sleep. Alan's voice rattled around my head. Sentimental value doesn't override deed restrictions. Who did he think he was? I'd inherited this place from my grandfather, who had worked 40 years in a machine shop to pay off every inch of this land. These HOA busybodies had only moved in after some developer paved over a soybean field and built 30 identical houses. They'd never laid hands on a hammer, never smelled sawdust in the summer sun. It was my land. The shed was mine, and I would fight for it. Over the next few days, I did research. I read every line of the HOA charter, every bylaw, every fine print paragraph. There was no mention of retroactive enforcement on structures built before the HOA was founded. In fact, there was a clause that exempted grandfathered structures in continued use, which described my shed perfectly. When I brought this up at the next HOA board meeting, Alan looked annoyed. He tried to wave me off, but I read the clause out loud, word for word. The other board members shifted uncomfortably, but Alan kept that shark smile glued to his face. "You're welcome to appeal," he said. "We'll vote on it next month. I could barely afford to wait. They were already threatening me with fines, and the stress was eating me alive. I went home with my blood boiling. That's when I decided to go after Alan himself. The weeks after Alan's eviction felt strangely quiet. It didn't take long for the HOA to name a new president.